بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh and welcome. We're extremely blessed and honoured to be gathered here today in the beautiful gardens of the CMC to hear Dr. Rothman share his book, Developing a Model of Islamic Psychology and Psychotherapy, Islamic Theology and Contemporary Understandings of Psychology. Dr. Rothman, your research is a seminal contribution to the Islamic psychology movement, wherein the topic of the soul converges with Islamic theology and contemporary psychology. And so in your book, you've integrated two key areas of importance. The first one is having a theologically anchored model of the soul that's rooted in primary sources from within the Islamic paradigm. And the second is amalgamating that with contemporary notions of psychology. And what Dr. Rothman's done, which is unique, is unifying them into a practical clinical framework so that therapists can use that for diagnosis and management and treatment in Islamic psychotherapy. So tell us, Dr. Rothman, what was the impetus for the book?
Thank you for the introduction, and it's good to be here with everybody. It's an honor that people have an interest in this enough to give up this beautiful Saturday afternoon, so I'm humbled by that. And so the impetus for this book really came from my own clinical practice as a psychotherapist. And what I was doing was integrating, so I was in private practice and also working in clinical mental health settings, but at the same time I was studying with different scholars and shayukh throughout the Muslim world and trying to understand from an Islamic perspective and model how to integrate that into my own practice. And so I had the benefit of being guided by my teachers, but still I was doing my own practice of integration and really from this sort of creative approach to try to figure out how to merge these things. And I found that I had colleagues in the field who were doing similar things, and that everybody, or amongst these colleagues sort of around the world, people would be trying to, in an ad hoc fashion, figure out how do they make sense of Islam and what we know about Islamic principles and the knowledge of the soul in the context of what we now know as contemporary psychology, psychotherapy. And what I found in that what people tend to do is that without a framework to do that within, you wind up going to the framework that exists, which is what we all learn when we study psychology, and that framework is really has it has an epistemological bias, and that epistemological bias is grounded in a notion of the human being that is oftentimes looked at in terms of what can be seen and what can be measured and what is understood from rational thought and behavior. Right? The science of psychology, sort of in academia, is known as the study of mental processes and behavior. And certainly that is an aspect from an Islamic perspective of the human being and how we come to know knowledge through rational thought and rational proofs. But so epistemology is the how we come to know things. What are the sources of knowledge, right? And so in an Islamic epistemology, we include the rational proofs, but then there's also revelation. And from the revelation, there are things that we understand from the ghaib, from the unseen world. So things like ilham, which is inspiration, things like ru'ya, which is true dreams, things like khawatir, which are involuntary suggestions that come into the heart. And so all of these things are formulate an ontology. And so these big words, epistemology, ontology. Ontology is how we know how we define being. So the human experience. And that is based on our sources of knowledge. And so from Islam sort of has this larger picture that includes the physical realm. It includes things like our thoughts and our rational notions of self and and cognition, but it includes much more because we're dealing with the soul. And so that obviously will change what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about psychology, about treatment, about where a person would develop towards and for what reason. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that what we learn from like a Western Academy of Psychology, that all of it is not relevant. A lot of it is relevant, and certainly doesn't mean that there is one Western psychological approach, because there are lots of different approaches. However, there's definitely a dominant discourse in psychology that is avowedly secular. And within that, you have anomalies of people or movements of people recognizing something like the soul or the transpersonal aspect of the human being, but often they're pulling from lots of different traditions, right? It's not from one silsila of knowledge. And from what we have in Islam is we have a silsila of knowledge and of following how we understand how this all fits together. And we have a really detailed science of this, science of the soul. And so you could say, well, then all we have to do is go back and look at what the classical scholars wrote about ilm an-nafs, about the science of the soul, because psychology really means the study of the soul. But it's not that simple, because there really wasn't a field of psychology as such that we know it now. It was really sort of split amongst different Islamic sciences. So you have aspects of the knowledge of the soul that come from fiqh, from Islamic law and jurisprudence. You have aspects that come from kalam or theology. You have aspects that come from tasawwuf. And so what you would find is that, when a lot of the scholars that we now talk about as the foundation of Islamic psychology, like for instance, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi wasn't known as a psychologist because there was no such thing as a separate discipline of psychology. All of our early scholars were like polymaths. They were adept at many different sciences, and because they were brilliant, but also because you have to understand all these different sciences in order to understand the human being, because the Islamic picture of the human being is holistic and it's integrated. And so now we have come away from that holistic understanding, and we have sectioned off knowledge. And so now we have even scholars that will study one specific thing and be mastered in this one specific field of knowledge or this one book, and may not have an understanding of what that means for the development of the human being in a holistic picture of where we're trying to go in this life. And from Islam, all of the Islamic sciences, really at the core, it is a study of the soul. So you can't really define it as one thing, it's throughout. But so now, being that we have a collective consciousness of this thing called psychology, it sort of becomes imperative for us to understand the Islamic tradition in the sense of what we come to understand as psychology, and sort of reorient to that knowledge, but revive it and update it to the contemporary world and contemporary times so that it becomes applicable, right? We don't want it to just stay, or my impetus for this book was that I wanted to find a way to create this framework, but in a way that doesn't just deal with all of the permutations of what you could talk about of the soul, but what does that actually mean for what we now understand in, it's sort of understood that we have these thing called the study of psychology, and we work on ourselves in therapy or counseling. And so now, well, how can we understand all of the depth of that and distill it in a way that makes it applicable for all of us normal people that need help?
Right. So I think it would be really helpful for everyone if you could just tell us more about why Islamic psychology became your specific passion.
So, without going too much into the details of the, so for instance, in the book, there's these reflection boxes throughout the whole book. And in these reflection boxes, I'm talking about myself and my story. But it's not because I think that my story is important.
They're really good. They're really insightful reflections.
And so the purpose of them is to sort of unveil that there's a real human being behind the process of research, and not fall into this notion that things are removed and detached. And oftentimes we have this approach to social sciences where we're trying to remove bias. And what happens by trying to remove bias is the bias comes in even more strongly, because it's basically denial. It's denial that there's real human beings, and real human beings are complex. And we all come from different positions, and we have positionality, and we have cultural frameworks from which we understand things. And so the methodology that I used in this book is one that embraces that. So constructivist grounded theory is the methodology that I use, and the idea is that it's to sort of dispel this notion that is there wasn't a real human being, and that the process was not complex and complicated. And so that's why I'm talking about myself, not because, again, that I think my story is important, but it's important in the context of this. So if you notice, the book is called Developing a Model of Islamic Psychology. And so there, as much as I'm trying to get to a consensual model based on the Islamic sciences and have the input of scholars, you could conceive of this in different ways depending on what angle you come from. And so my background, I think, is important to highlight because I'm sort of an insider in multiple ways. I'm a Muslim, obviously, so I'm a believer in the Islamic tradition and the Islamic epistemology and the Islamic paradigm, but I'm also a therapist. And so I'm understanding it from these different angles, and then how I came into Islam. So I say that just because I don't want to I talk about myself only in the context that it makes sense to understand. And so but briefly, my journey to Islam was actually the same as my journey in psychology. So they weren't really separate. So it was through my trying to understand a science of the soul, because my approach to psychology was very much what that word means, the study of the soul. And so within that, I was always really keen on looking for the depth of understanding from, like I mentioned, transpersonal psychology. So my grandfather actually was one of the pioneers of humanistic psychology. And humanistic psychology was this sort of movement within psychology that recognized the, I think, epistemological bias and tried to bring in this unseen aspect and recognize that the human being has more depth and that there's a soul and there's potentially a relationship to God even. But it was still within this secular academy. And so within that, there was no, again, like silsila. There was, let's learn from the Eastern traditions. Let's take from Hinduism. Let's take from Buddhism. Let's take from... And that works to a degree because there's a lot of resonance throughout all of these traditions. And so the idea is like, what else is there besides just behavior and mental processes? And so I sort of went on my own. So my grandfather, at one point, I was really keen. I was starting to get into psychology. And so one of the things he told me before he passed away was that he wished that he had involved religion more in his work. And that he saw the need for people to understand, or what these different spiritual traditions can bring to our understanding of psychology. And so I sort of took that as like the torch being passed on and in the legacy. And I, simultaneously, as I was studying psychology, I was traveling the world and studying different religions. And finding that there was a lot of similarity and a lot of resonance in all these different traditions. But it was through that journey that I actually came to find Islam as having the most comprehensive science of the soul for what I was looking for as a practitioner of how can I understand the depths of how can you develop as a human being in a way that where we're not just coping with anxiety or depression, but understanding the larger picture of what are we here for. So almost these like existential questions. And so it was that sort of that led me into embrace Islam. It was actually just because I wanted to find a way of working that was that had a framework for understanding the spiritual reality of the human being and psychology. And I looked at every single tradition, and it was in Islam that it's just the whole thing was there. And so not only was I like, ooh, I need this for my work, it was a complete transformation for me, and I embraced Islam. Yeah.
So I need it for my life as well as my work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And you mentioned your grandfather, but there's another grandfather, Professor Malik Badri, I love mercy on his soul. Tell us how he influenced your thinking.
So yeah, it was sort of like almost I lost one grandfather and I gained another. And I actually met Professor Malik Badri I was actually studying with a sheikh in Sudan and trying to understand the depths of this knowledge within the Islamic tradition. And the sheikh he said, I want you to meet one of my top students because he's doing the same thing. He's integrated this knowledge with psychology. And so I was like, okay, great, I'll meet your student. I'm thinking somebody my age. And it turns out to be Professor Malik Badri, like the grandfather of Islamic psychology. And so this was within the year that I became Muslim, really. And so I was really, from the beginning, had the guidance from who Professor Malik really felt like a grandfather, and a mentor, and really guided me through, okay, now my real grandfather had sort of set the stage for look into this. It was the humanistic, the transpersonal, but then look at religion, meaning like not just spiritual concepts, but actually religion, meaning a commitment to a paradigm. And so I really spent a lot of time with Professor Malik. We would sort of be in Sudan every year, sitting at the foot of the sheikh, and in that, and then I would be talking to him throughout the year about what does this mean in clinical practice, and what about this, and how do I work with this case? And so he was really a pioneer in this work, and so I feel blessed to have been able to have these guides along the way.
So on page 9 of your book, just go to your book, you write, the practices decreed in Islam are therapeutic methods for correcting maladaptive behaviour, solving interpersonal problems, and achieving interpersonal growth, which are all primary aims of psychology. And when we were doing the course in Istanbul with yourself, Professor Skinner and Professor Badri, we got the chance to visit the Ottoman Health Museum in Edirne, where we got to see Islamic healthcare practiced holistically, and that's our own heritage. And in the foreword of your book, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, he says, what is today called mental health has thus been for the monotheisms a matter of absolutely central religious concern, since we are created to worship God, in Surah Dariyat, and thus to know him, and Sheikh continues, to perceive him, the very purpose of our creation. So however Muslim or not, there still exists a stigma surrounding mental health, and especially within Islam it's such a shame because it seems to be the very essence of our religion and helps us to fulfill our purpose that we were created for. So I just wanted to know, what does this book mean for mental health and for practitioners of Islamic psychology?
I think for mental health, it's my hope. I mean, I don't know if the book itself does this, but my hope for this book and things like it is that we broaden the picture of what we're talking about when we talk about mental health, and that it's not, the word mental health is, I think, problematic because of that first word, mental, right? Like, we think that means it's about thoughts, and so then it's therefore regulated to this experience of self and identity that's based in thoughts. This Cartesian notion of I think, therefore I am. But the reality from this Islamic holistic perspective is that it's the body, mind, soul, and even more. Like, it's a much more dynamic reality. And we need to understand that our identity, when we're talking about the self, we're talking about knowledge of the self, defining that self is really changes the nature of what you're then doing. And if we stay in this notion that we are these sort of like, that our consciousness and our identity could really just be sort of in jars, or like on Zoom, we all connect with each other as these severed heads. Whereas, today we're here in body, and it's a different experience. It's a different reality of like, my whole self can be here and we can be connecting, and what does that mean for who we really are? Like all these discussions of intelligence and AI, and could we upload our personality and our consciousness to a server? Yeah. And the reality is no, because from this paradigm, it's so much more dynamic in terms of what that means, in terms of who are we in relation to our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so for me, I think not only, for Muslim mental health, for Muslims in understanding mental health, it's redefining what the whole picture is. That it's not, okay, this is for people who have problems. This is for the majnoon people, the crazy people. But, that it's a spectrum, and that we all need help. We all are in a process of becoming. We're all on this journey of development, and we need to kind of not only reorient our understanding of mental health and mental illness, because often, and the other ironic thing is people say mental health, that's a good thing. That's not people equate that with mental illness, and I think we're confused on mental illness, mental health. And so what Sheikh Abdul Hakim is saying is that the two are not separate. Like the notion that theology and religion is somehow this abstract notion of theoretical understanding of what we're supposed to be doing, and then there's our regular life and how we become healthy, and those really need to be brought together. And so, and not only brought together in an integral understanding of the whole picture of what is, redefining Islam from the perspective of psychology, and redefining psychology from the perspective of Islam, and saying that they're not separate. We are on this journey of healing. And so I think what it stands to do is sort of redefine the purpose and of the deen itself, right? It's not supposed to be this set of transactions that are just regulated to behavior. It's meant to be transformational. It's meant to give us a map for how do we develop, how do we go from what we are and what we are veiled from to what our potential is. And that is all about a process of change, and it requires self-knowledge and self-inquiry. And that's at the heart of pretty much everything that we learn from the Quran and the Sunnah. And so what does this mean for practitioners is I'm hoping that what I've done is I've tried to create a way of providing a framework of all the stuff that can really get abstract and sort of out there, and it gets into all of these really complicated concepts of theology, but that's not really useful if it stays in this level of theory for the scholars. The whole idea is that it's supposed to be for people to have a pathway. And so for practitioners, it's defining. So what I've done is I created sort of 3 diagrams that are in different chapters. And one is the understanding of the anatomy of the soul, to understand what is the human being. It's not just thoughts, it's the whole picture, and how does that connect to our original primordial reality and where we're going. But then what does that mean for processes of change? So then what? What do we do? How do we understand that in terms of what are the dynamics of how something does go from one thing to the other? How does that process of change happen? And then the third diagram or model is for practitioners to understand the scope of something like Islamic psychotherapy, where we already have this notion of people coming and seeing a therapist for guidance. That's sort of like adi now. It's like normal. People, it's accessible. Whereas maybe finding a sheikh to go on this deep journey of the soul is very difficult to find that. To find people at this stage and to be in the scenario where we have access to that is impractical for many of us. And yet we still need this guidance. And so this provides an understanding of what can still remain in something like psychotherapy, where you have somebody who's gone through some amount of training. And for many of us, we're just trying to reach equilibrium. You know, we have things that come up, presenting problems, they get in our way, they keep us from just sort of healthy functioning sometimes, or we're just really struggling, we get down and it gets in the way. And so we need to have a middle ground to be able to deal with these things, but still be integrating a spiritual perspective and reality. And so what it does is it means that the practitioner is it's not just a job that somebody goes and learns to, do a certain theoretical intervention, and if I follow the things it will work and unlock the person's problem, but that it's orienting the therapist to actually be working on their own development and their own self-knowledge, and that it becomes a in-between space that allows for spiritual guidance and spiritual reality, but allows for different levels for what the client needs and different levels for what the therapist is actually able to do.
So we're mentioning a lot that is Islamic psychology specifically, but do you have to be a Muslim to be able to access this model and for it to be applied to you? Or if you were a therapist, could you work with somebody who wasn't a Muslim using this model?
Yes, I do. I frequently work with non-Muslims, but I'm coming from an Islamic approach. And so now people wonder, well, what does that mean and how does that work? So I mentioned that there's different levels. So like the Islamic paradigm is like a multiplex approach or reality. We understand that there are different dimensions of things, right? So we have this physical dimension, and we have this unseen dimension, and then we have this divine reality. And you can't expect everybody to be at the same level. We're all at different stations. And so for a Muslim, it's going to make sense within that paradigm to talk about things like Aqidah and about the state of the person as a slave of Allah. Whereas for a non-Muslim, that may be really foreign language, but also they're not at this place of belief, right? And so that doesn't mean you have to water it down. It means that there's different levels of entry points. And within that, the Islamic paradigm allows for people to be where they are. Why? Because only Allah knows what's in the state of somebody's heart, right? So even the ones of us who call ourselves Muslims, we identify with that, but are we at the level of being in the deep state of Islam where we completely understand that we're a slave of Allah? For at least not all the time. And so even with Muslims, you're going to have to deal with different levels. And so why not allow for non-Muslims to benefit from this rich, vast resource of understanding the human being at whatever entry level point makes sense? people are doing it now with Buddhism. If you go into the bookstore and you look at the self-help section or the pop psychology, 80% of the books are influenced by Buddhism. But most of the people reading them and benefiting from them are not Buddhist, right? And so you could say, well, it's different. People say, well, it's not a religion, but at the core of people have their own level or place of what they have bought into, what their state of belief is, and I think what we can do is we can allow for those things to be there. So it's not that people can still benefit and get what they want from it, and at the same time, we don't deny that. So for me as a Muslim, as a believing Muslim, I believe that the human being's state and its maximum potential is to recognize its slavehood to Allah. And that may be really outside of the fold from somebody who's just really focused on being in a state of calm and peace in the self, and then the self sort of, a lot of, like we have a whole art practice of tafakkur in Islam, of contemplation, and the idea is that the goal of it is not just to come into a place of peace in the self, but through that coming into a place of peace, then the self is surrendering itself to God. And so I don't think there's a need to shy away from that. That's what I believe, that's the reality, that's what's there. But I also can work with somebody who doesn't believe that, and I either don't go there to that degree, or I use different terminology, but I'm still working with what makes sense to them at their level. And so sometimes that means using language that makes sense to them, being culturally sensitive, using terminology that makes sense, but also letting them lead the way. Like what feels right for them to where they are trying to go. But what I have found is that the Islamic tradition of what I'm calling Islamic psychology has such an enormous amount to offer that there is no need to limit it to Muslims. And I have found that I have non-Muslim clients who have come to me and said that through working with me they feel closer to their Christian faith than they do when they go to church. And I'll use concepts like dhikr, where we would usually say Allah in the heart perhaps, or say something that, La ilaha illallah, but for somebody where that doesn't make sense, I find out, well, what makes sense to you? What is the word or phrase that brings you into a state of an experience of oneness, of interconnectedness, right? Because that's what Tawheed is. And we understand it from this religious perspective, but really all it is a recognition of reality. And the metaphysical reality can be recognized by all people and all traditions and all faiths. And that's why we see resonance throughout different traditions.
I guess because we all have a soul, that's why the model applies to everybody.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I just want to go back to Professor Badri, because he's such an influential person in this whole field. More than 40 years ago, he was writing one of his main works, The Dilemma of the Muslim Psychologist, and in it he mentions the Islamization of mental health and of psychology, and the potential issues that this causes somebody, a Muslim, when they're seeking help. What did Professor Badri mean by Islamization?
Yeah, so it's complicated because there's a whole historical sort of arc to that, and there was an Islamization movement, and there's a lot of different versions of what Islamization means. But for Professor Malik, he was at a time when he was talking about these things. He was studying psychology in the late 60s, and then started speaking about it in the early to mid 70s. And he found that he was in the Muslim world. He came here to the UK to study, but then he went back to the Muslim world, to Sudan, and then in Lebanon, in Beirut. And he found that the Muslims who were studying psychology as well as other academic sciences from the Western Academy had sort of completely taken on the epistemological biased secular paradigm of these social sciences in particular, and had sort of completely disconnected from any notion of this Islamic paradigm, even though they were practicing Muslims. And so they would do this split. And so I think there was a lot of sort of post-colonial response to inferiority, and if we adopt this scientific paradigm and we adopt what they're doing in the Western Academy, we will be seen as more legitimate. And this Islamic knowledge is sort of backwards, and so we sort of reject it. And so what he identified when he was talking, so sometimes Islamization is, let's take these Western approaches to science or social sciences with these epistemological bias, and let's use Islamic terminology to sort of match it up to what we understand in our tradition, so it sort of makes sense, and it can be this almost cultural adaptation sometimes. But what Professor Malik was talking about was actually much deeper level of saying, look, we can't assume to understand psychology without understanding the nature of the human being. And our understanding of the nature of the human being from Islam is much different from what we're learning in these secular Western academies. And so he started to speak out against this or about this, just to sort of bring it to people's attention. And he noticed in this book, he talks about 3 stages of the Muslim psychologist. First, infatuation, then reconciliation, and then emancipation. And infatuation was you're just, it's all, whatever they say, I'm going to adopt it, even though it doesn't match what we're learning in Islam about the human being. And then the reconciliation phase is, maybe the Freud's id is like the nafs al-lawama. Or, and they start matching up our concepts from the Quran and make it make sense to this paradigm, but without deconstructing the paradigm itself. And so what he was saying is that process of reconciliation and often what people are calling Islamization is like taking a building that is no longer useful and it's sort of falling apart and it's decrepit, and you want to make it work and work for your purposes, and so you put a fresh coat of paint on it. And yet the whole infrastructure is falling apart, it's not fit for purpose. But if we put this paint, it'll look nice. And so he was saying that this approach to Islamization is essentially like putting an Islamic paint. So we sprinkle some Islamic terms here and there, and we make it sort of culturally appropriate, which, to be honest, is a lot of what's happening still today. When we talk about Muslim mental health, it's mental health from the Western secular epistemological approach with Muslims and culturally adapting it. And what he was saying is, no, you need to actually tear down the building and build a completely new foundation. And that you don't have to get rid of everything that you tore down. Like maybe there's some good wood and some good useful bricks that are still able to be used in the new construction, meaning that there's a lot we've learned from this development of this field of psychology. There's useful things in it, but we have to be able to discern what is within the Islamic paradigm, like so using the Furqan, right, the criterion of the Quran as the measure. And so he was saying the emancipation phase is when we're released from this notion that somehow, we embrace our own heritage and recognize that it's all there, but we need to adapt and understand it anew. And so he was saying, well, let's build this new construction. And so he told me before he passed away, Allah have mercy on him, that he felt like this was the first bricks in this new construction. Alhamdulillah.
So you mentioned the Quran and the Islamic history. Just to put it in context again, is that our great Islamic scholars of like Imam al-Ghazali and the Ihya al-Madin and Abu Zayd al-Balkhi and Assistants of the Soul, they spoke long ago about ilm al-nafs and the treatments to treat the medical illnesses. Why is it important to have knowledge of the self, and why should it be based on what we know from the Quran and the Sunnah and the sciences of theology, kalam, jurisprudence, fiqh and tasawwuf, which is spirituality.
So the knowledge of the self, the reason that is so crucial is so we have this saying that it's debatable what it's attributed to, but all of the scholars seem to agree of its validity, is that he who knows himself knows his Lord. And why is that? Is because multiple levels, multiple reasons, but that our true self, our core of who we are, is our ruh. And that ruh, the spiritual reality of our soul, is directly connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and directly connected to our knowledge and our witnessing of the fact that we are servants of God. And so this goes back to before we existed in this plane, we are on the, Allah said, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And we all of the souls said, Bala, shahidna. But shahidna is often translated as we testify, right? And that there's this notion that we recognize or we cognitively understand that God is my God, right? But shahid means witness, means to an actual witnessing the reality, seeing what is. And that's very different than using our cognitive, rational understanding to try to make sense of something. It is just a knowing. I witness what is. And when we come into this world, we're veiled from that reality, and we go into this whole trajectory of thinking that we're separate individual beings, which we are, because it's a paradox in our reality. So there is tawheed, there's oneness, there is the interconnectedness, but our experience is separateness. My experience is here of Abdallah, and I have my own problems and my own history and my memories and what that does for me, and then I have this notion that I make decisions, I have free will, and I'm self-directed or self-guided. And that's true within a certain dimension of reality. But the real reality underneath that is this, what we knew on the plane of Alastu bi rabbikum, the witnessing that I am actually just a slave of Allah and I have nothing to do with my own self-direction. It's from Allah. And so the knowledge of the self is coming back to this knowing. And how do we get back to this knowing? Because the knowing, it's in us. It's literally in our heart. And I point here, not necessarily just to this thing that's pumping blood on my left side, but my physical being is part of my soul. And by knowing myself, I'm going in this journey of uncovering and discovering what has been covered over. Because the truth is, before I came in, when we were babies, so Noura over here, this beautiful, pure baby, she's closer to Allah than any of us because she came in pure, right? And alhamdulillah, she has really good parents, so inshallah she'll be preserved. But to a degree, we all are going to start to cover over this truth because we have the pain of the dunya. We have these trials, this bala, these tribulation, and each bala, each test of separation gets us further from this direct witnessing of the reality that Allah is holding us and guiding us. And so this creates all of these psychological imbalances and physical imbalances and the whole thing. And so knowledge of self, looking inward, doing this internal uncovering and the work is the work. It's what's at the heart of Islam. Being a Muslim is not something you just sign up for and you get your card and you're a Muslim. It's somebody who is in a state of Islam. And in order to be in a state of Islam, you have to be doing some work to inculcate the state of Islam. And that means inner struggle, inner jihad. And so that's it's a process really of coming into knowledge of the self. And so, what was the other part of that question? Why is it important for it to be connected to the Islamic sciences?
Yeah.
Because we could get lost on our own. And so, there's no way, because we have all defined ourselves in ways that are not actually accurate to who we really are. We think we know who we are because my name's Abdallah, I'm from this place, I do this thing. When you tell somebody who you are, when you say you meet somebody, you usually tell them where you're from and what your work is, and maybe what's your favorite food or something. That's not really who you are. And so we need guidance to understand what is the human being. So that's why it's so important. This first model that I put in the book is, let's first understand the anatomy of the soul. And we can't understand that without revelation. We wouldn't just suddenly, Allah does put it in people's hearts, but for the most part, we need to learn this. And so it's really important that it's grounded in these Islamic sciences, and that it's grounded in this silsila of knowledge and the embodiment in the example of the Prophet ﷺ. Because we're not left on our own to figure this out. We've been given a map in the Quran, and we've been given a map in the Prophet ﷺ as the living Quran.
So we're going to have to wrap up soon, but there's one last question that I wanted to ask you. Is you're now the principal of Cambridge Muslim College, and the college is going to be offering a diploma in Islamic psychology. Why did you join the CMC, and how do you think that Islamic psychology will help fulfill the mission of the college, and where do you see us going in the future?
Yeah, so it's a real honor for Allah to have put me in this position. It feels like a huge amana, because I see Cambridge Muslim College as holding a really important place in the development, not only of the Ummah internationally, but really a beacon of being able to show the world, the whole world, what Islam has to offer, that in a way that's relevant to our times. And this is really the mission of the college, is what does the Islamic tradition have to offer in a way that has real practical solutions to the difficulties of our current times. And so for me, Islamic psychology, why that fits in, because I think a lot of people, when they found out this guy Abdallah Rothman is going to be the principal of Cambridge Muslim College, like, why? He's not an Islamic studies scholar. He's a psychologist. Like, what does that have to do with Islamic studies? But so I feel like the way that we're moving and what's needed is that we need to understand how the knowledge in these Islamic sciences is actually applicable and practical for people to put into practice. We don't need a whole bunch of people that have memorized books. We have the books for that. We need people who have understood the knowledge, and from the understanding of that knowledge, it has illuminated their heart. And this is where we come back into, in order for the heart to be illuminated, one needs to be doing this self-investigation and self-knowledge. And that needs to be integrated with our study of Islam, because it always has been. This is a new development that our notion of scholarship is memorizing texts and then spewing out what it was said in the text. My teachers, when I would go and study with the shaykh that I studied with, the books, I was constantly wanting to study books, and they never even let me. It was always tarbiyah. It was always, you do life, and you learn through living, and you work on yourself, and that's where the knowledge comes from. It's ilm al-tawakkul. By having faith in Allah, the knowledge can be illuminated in you. And so I think that has a direct relationship to Islamic psychology, is that we need to understand that this is the work we have to do, and it's integral to our relationship to Islam and our study of Islam. And then in addition to that, this whole process of of this field of Islamic psychology being a thing now, it's because of the contemporary times we're living in. Like I said, we don't really have, we're all living in these separate sort of disaggregated ways of living. We don't have communities where we have access to the learned people who are living rightly guided. And, you know, we're blessed to have Sheikh Abdul Hakim as one of the gems, but they're few and far between. And so we need to start to disseminate this or distill this knowledge in a way that we can make sense of for just the regular problems of today and the regular ways that we need to apply these things, not in like I said, the permutations of the depths of these discussions of what the soul could be. Great, I'm sure that would be a great other book, right? I'm sure somebody could do a whole study on all of the realities of what Islam says about the soul, but I was interested in what's the most important to understand for change. And so this field is now a thing. It's not just me doing this. There's a whole Professor Malik really was instrumental in developing a field of Islamic psychology, and it has now caught on. It has a lot of attention, especially in the last few years. And in addition to this book, I recently published, co-edited with Dr. Amber Hawk, a book called Islamic Psychology Around the Globe. And the reason we did this book is to highlight that this has been happening. The development has been happening not just in Western countries, not just in America and the UK, but Nigeria, Somalia, South Africa, Egypt, Pakistan, India, all these countries represented. And it goes back and traces what the development has been over the sort of 40 years since Professor Malik has been doing it, but also before him, even like Muhammad Najati from Egypt, and a lot of people developing this work. And so now we have this diploma in Islamic psychology here at Cambridge Muslim College. Alhamdulillah, this is something, again, when I told Professor Malik that we were finally doing the program that he and I have been trying to do for years, but every time we would go to a university, it would be like, well, we don't want the word Islamic. Like, what is this? You know, you can't have Islamic psychology. Nobody could wrap their head around it. And so it makes perfect sense within Cambridge Muslim College, because we have the benefit of having these real scholars of Islam to understand the grounding in the Islamic tradition, but also that this is the aim and the mission of the college, is to develop ways of bringing this into our contemporary world. And so it fits perfectly within the mission, and I'm really excited to see where it goes, and honored to just be helping to move it along, inshallah, to benefit not only the community, the ummah, but also I think all of humanity has a lot to benefit from what Islam has to offer and the knowledge of the soul.
There's a lot to look forward to, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Sister's asking, do you have to, Dr. Rothman was talking about accepting the person where they are in the therapy, and Sister saying, if somebody's has done something that's particularly negative or harmful to others, do you still have to accept them where they are in those circumstances?
That's a good question. I mean, the parameters of therapy, there's ethics involved, right? And ethics from a secular professional standpoint would both not allow for that. Like, so anytime that there's somebody who's going to harm themselves or others, it's a duty of the therapist to report that in whatever way is appropriate, and not just sort of like you would in most everything else, and say, okay, I accept you, it's okay. The difference, though, is that from a secular or conventional approach that we find that, you know, that the standards are set sort of in therapeutic practice, it's kind of only whether somebody harms themselves or others, and the harming is defined very much physically. And then anything else is pretty much okay, right? Without a knowledge of or an acceptance of what may be really harmful for somebody spiritually. So from an Islamic framework, you would definitely still uphold the physical, like you would not, you would necessarily, from an Islamic ethical standpoint, need to keep them from harming
and have
others.
consequences rather than therapy, right?
It can be in conjunction with therapy. Yeah. So I mean, consequences usually are both punitive, like there has to be an actual consequence, but that doesn't mean that the person needs to be removed from mercy. Because in the process of healing, and in the process of the person actually having a transformation, there's going to need to be some level of mercy for them to be merciful with themselves, to then be honest with themselves and recognize that they've done some wrong. And so there's, again, talking about levels, there's different dynamics at play. It's not black and white. It's not one thing or the other. It's both and most of the time.
So
Yeah,
so just try and summarise what you've said. So that in the early 20th century, psychotherapy has been given way to psychopharmacology and medications being at the forefront of, I guess, services. So is there a way to, what was the second part?
Yeah, so have you thought about how to create an evidence?
Oh yeah,
for Islamic psychotherapy?
Yeah, so should we create an evidence base for Islamic psychotherapy to increase funding and forward the field?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have a lot of colleagues who are working on that. There's actually probably more work in this area than anywhere else in terms of the development of Islamic psychology, because most people are trying to do this within their framework, like let's say a university, a psychology department, and in order for them to be taken seriously, oftentimes you have to have evidence-based approaches. And so there's actually a lot of measurements now that either have to do with measuring religiosity, measuring aspects of from an Islamic psychology sort of framework, and there is a lot of effort into that. I think it's a good effort. It's not the focus of my work. One, because I'm not an experimental psychologist, but also because I think my focus, or let's say we got evidence-based things that would make the NHS happy to pay for treatment. The treatment that it's going to pay for, like you said, is dominated by pharmacology, is going to be, again, back in this biased notion of what we're treating and how we're treating it. And the goal of treatment is to remove symptoms. And how do we do that the quickest is pills. And why pills? Because somebody stands to make money at the other end of it. And so again, when we talk about Professor Malik's, the emancipation and the building of a new framework, that's still part of that other building. That's still part of that other framework, which I'm not interested in just making adaptations to fit within. I think the whole thing needs to be restructured. And so and again, I think there's room for this. I encourage people to do the evidence-based things. I think it's useful. But my focus is on changing the whole script altogether to where we're not relying so much on evidence-based. It sort of goes back to the whole bias of if we see it, then it exists. If we don't see it, it doesn't exist. And I think my passion and my focus is let's be comfortable with allowing for the soul and the unseen to be a part of the picture of the human experience, rather than being so sort of freaked out by it that we have to constantly be giving physical measurements to say it's okay. And I'm not to say maybe there's ways of doing that allow for the spiritual realm in that, and so people are working on that, and I'm happy that they are. It's useful. It's just not my focus. Yeah, thank you.
Brothers wanted to know about the success stories that you've had with applying the framework clinically to patients, and how patients have improved, or service users have improved.
So for me, it's a complicated question, because then you get at which came first, the chicken or the egg? Like, so for instance, cognitive behavioral therapy, I learned in my master's degree from a completely secular institution. And I was told that that was invented by a guy named Beck in like the 20th century. But then really, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi wrote an entire manuscript on what is exactly cognitive behavioral therapy, but in the 9th century. And so which am I now, is that Western psychology that I'm adapting to Islam, or is that actually more Islamic? You know, where's the integration? And so for me, because I've been really interested in developing the indigenous approach and really understanding from this different paradigm, I'm sort of integrating and trying as much as I can not to make separation and distinctions, but I'm using all of the tools from my tool belt based on the whole journey that I've had. And so certainly there's going to be a lot of, even in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a lot of things that I would have learned in my training of like talk therapy, and like there's like manuals of CBT where you say a statement and you're restructuring the thought. That in the manualized version and a very practical, applicable thing doesn't necessarily exist in Abu Zayd al-Balkhi's work. So I would be utilizing that because it's one of the pieces of wood or brick from the building that's useful. But the cognitive statements that the way that I'm reframing and restructuring is not in and of itself the goal, the end goal. It is a tool in helping the person to really get in touch with their heart. So I may be starting with the thoughts if the person is attached to their thoughts and they really need to tell this story, or they're stuck on the cognitive frame of like, let's say they have a cognitive statement that keeps getting repeated that they perceive as being the cause of the problem. So I'll start there and I'll do what you would perceive as cognitive behavioral therapy, but then I'm quickly going to be wanting to move into where's the core of that thought in the spiritual material that exists in the heart that's connected to the thought. So what I may do is have them focus on that thought. We go through like what's problematic about this thought, where did it come from, but not to retell the whole story, just to identify where it's located. And then I'm going to then guide them into actually experiencing their heart. So I might even say, okay, now you have this notion of this thought that's up here, because usually people identify thoughts with being located in their head, even though that's sort of an abstraction. And then I sort of say, bow your head to your heart and connect with where is it now coming up here? And so then it's coming into a physical experience. And so it's almost like now it's maybe, you could call it somatic experiencing work, which is a whole, thing that exists. You might see me doing it and say, oh, he must be doing somatic experiencing work. But this is also from Islamic medicine and Tib and prophetic medicine, and understanding all these things as integral. And so then I would locate or help them understand what does it actually feel like here, rather than just a statement and a thought. And what I'm trying to get at is, at what point did this maladaptive thought occur because of some traumatic event where they covered over the truth in their heart? So, right, we're babies with pure hearts, and then something happens, whether it's being mistreated by a parent or having a traumatic experience that's really nobody else's fault other than you experienced something traumatic, and something happens into your heart. You forget the oneness of Allah. You forget that you're held in Allah's mercy. You forget that Allah is there with you. You forget the witnessing. And so then that covering over of the heart, it's created a block to your ability to surrender and submit and witness. But there may be a cognitive statement that's attached to that, but that is connected on a deeper level to an emotional block in your qalb, in your heart. And then once that's released and opened, and like you can go like this, it opens up so it can air, then what you do is you the medicine in the wound. And the medicine is dhikr Allah, or remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The remembrance, not just saying Allah exists, but it's, oh, Allah was actually there at that point when I forgot that Allah was there, that caused this whole trajectory of imbalance and problematic behavior and relationship issues. But you sort of, I don't need the whole story. I don't need the whole cognitive story to unlock it and retell the narrative, because it actually exists as a spiritual reality in the heart.
So the question's about the concept of spiritual bypassing in Islamic psychotherapy, and how would you overcome it?
Well, he's introduced a term that I haven't defined, so let me define that term. So spiritual bypassing is actually a word that was developed by John Wellwood, who's a psychologist, and it's used in literature. And the idea is that one would sort of skip over the work, the developmental work that one needs to do to uncover the reality of what it is that they're stuck on, or the work they need to do internally and in terms of self-reflection and accountability, by sort of attaching to spiritual precepts or understanding. So this happens often in our community, unfortunately, in the Muslim community, where we say, well, you shouldn't have depression, because if you were a good Muslim and you had Iman, then you wouldn't be depressed, right? Which is completely untrue for many reasons, but we have all kinds of stories of not only the Prophet, but tons of prophets experiencing sadness, and there's a whole year of sadness, it's a reality of the human experience. But we have this notion that, if you remember I talked about Islam becoming transactional rather than transformational. And so we have this transactional notion, much like the medical model where we want to take a pill to get rid of the symptoms. We want to we'll ask the sheikh, what's the dua? Tell me the dua that I need to read so I can skip over this difficulty. And so the notion is the difficulty is a problem. We're problematizing the struggle, and we're saying, well, I want to get to the place where I'm comfortable. But the reality is that the bala, the trial, the test, is the doorway to Allah. So if our goal is to skip over it, then we're going to skip over the transformation. And then it becomes transactional, right? Give me this thing so I can just get to Jannah. But the journey to Jannah is really, the work has to be done here and now, and you have to go through the difficulty. And so when the bala comes on you, it is a doorway that squeezes you. We experience it as a squeeze and a difficulty and oh, this is uncomfortable, I don't want this. But if we accept it and allow it to open, and we sort of submit to it and surrender to it. Why would we be surrendering to it? Because we recognize it's from Allah. Everything is from Allah. La ilaha illallah. There is no source of anything happening other than Allah. Even the thing that we think is horrible, that we don't like. Allah says there may be something that we don't like and it's good for us. There may be something that's good, not good for us and we like it. And so we have to struggle, be in the struggle, this jihad and nafs, and in order to unlock the key. And so what you're asking is, when I was describing opening the difficulty and the wound, let's say, and putting in the medicine, which is dhikr of Allah, what can happen is our relationship to dhikr of Allah is, I've learned this phrase, the shaykh has told me this phrase, I'm going to cognitively repeat the phrase. So we're using our cognitive statements to say the thing that's better, right? And so this often is what CBT does, is it's just only at the level of replacing the maladaptive thought with the more useful thought. And that can help at a certain level, but it's a relatively surface level. And so then we can spiritual bypass with just saying La ilaha illallah, but not opening our hearts right? So for a lot of us, we're only doing dhikr in our mind. But what dhikr, it has to be dhikr of the heart in order for it to transform. And so we have to first experience our heart and even know how to be in our heart and know how to open it in order for the medicine to take effect, for it to get into the wound to do its work. Right? And so a lot of my work in therapy is really helping, just getting the person to be able to, first of all, like that you have a heart. Most of us don't even, they think it's just a physical pumping blood thing. And so you have to, coming into even just, oh wow, I have legs. Okay, I have a body. Okay, now, and then helping people realize, like, when you feel emotion, when you feel nervousness, when you feel anxiety, when you feel love even, you get this fluttering in your heart, right? We call it butterflies. But it's a reality, it's a living reality of the emotion. So the Prophet ﷺ said that our hearts are like a pot of water, and they bubble. And the bubbling of the water is these emotions coming to the surface. And when we want to come into a state of nafs al-mutma'ina is when the bubbles come to rest. The soul at rest is that the bubbles are going to come. The bubbles aren't problematic. The bubbles need to be there. They're our response to the dunya. We have difficulty, we get squeezed, we have a reaction. And then the reaction is a signpost to say, what do you need to look at? What do you need to deal with? What do you need to clean? What do you need to purify? And then we can look at it, do the work, do the purification, all these, there's tons of different tools that we have in the Islamic tradition to do this. And then eventually we train ourselves to learn how to come back into balance, to bring the bubbles back to the surface and to be in a state of rest. But then they're going to come again, because our natural state, the human state, changes something like hundreds of times in a day, right? And so this is why we have to, the prayer even, salah is healing. It's bringing us back to this state of rest if we're doing it with khushu, but it's the bare minimum. This is why it's fard, why it's obligatory. Is like you need at least 5 times a day throughout the day where you're coming back into a place of remembrance. But in between, you also need to be doing it. I mean, we can forget in a second. And we go into ghafla, forgetfulness of Allah. And then this is how we're constantly in this ebbs and flows of forgetting and remembering and forgetting and remembering. And it's natural, but we have to be engaged in the process. And so to bring it back to the answer, the engagement in the process is how you don't spiritual bypass. So not just the transactional saying of the phrase, but what does it feel like to struggle with trying to emulate the reality of that in your heart.
Okay, so it's questions about adapting the work in Islamic psychology to children and young people. What other changes would you make if you're approaching a child or a young person in therapy?
Yeah, it's a good question. A child has a soul just like a grown, we're all oftentimes grown children, but we all have a soul, so it's the same thing, but depending on the level of development, the treatment or the approach to the child has to be according to their developmental stage. Otherwise you could do damage, or you could misunderstand, or it could not land. And so in our Islamic pedagogy, it's attributed to Ali ibn Abi Talib, says that 7. We play with them for 7 years, we teach them for 7 years, and we befriend them for 7 years. And this is this developmental reality of the development of the child that is crucial to understand and deal with them at that level. So that means what I'm doing in terms of processing cognitive things, or helping somebody identify with their self and their nafs and You wouldn't do that with a 6-year-old or a 5-year-old because they're in this stage of play. And so you adapt the same principles in a way that makes sense to their developmental phase, so in play. Or if they're in from 7 to 14, it's you can actually start teaching them these things. So I have children who are in the first stage, 7, and I have 2 children that are in the second stage, although one of them is about out of it. And I keep telling her, like, I only have 1 year left to teach you, and then I'm out. I've got to teach you everything I know before you turn 14. And she always jokes about that. But what I'll do with my own children is, with my 6-year-old, if he's really, like, say, angry and feeling ghadab, like, so when we have anger come up, the blood boils, and there's prescriptions. The Prophet ﷺ said, if you're standing, sit down. If you're sitting, lie down. Make wudu. So those are really useful techniques for a child. But I'm not going to, like I said, very little talking, but I'm going to be like, just sit with him, get down to his level, again, metaphorically and physically, and just like, I'm here. It must feel, I hear it sounds like you're feeling, whatever. I try to use ways to describe it, and then maybe I'll put my hand on his chest and put my hand on my chest and just breathe. And get him to feel that I'm helping him regulate his state while I'm regulating my state. And these are the foundational things that are the building blocks that I wish all of us would have had this as children, because imagine how much tools we would have had as adults, right? And so I guess the answer to your question is it's completely applicable to any age, but you have to adapt it to where they're at. So I think that's that was like sort of the one part of your question. The other, you said something about, if they're on medication, because obviously they're part of this system where they give them medication, and you're right, there's certain age where really it's dangerous to be giving children medication because they're still in a state of development. It could affect that development. But so I would say, if you have to adapt to the reality. If they're on the medication, balance it out with something else. Like, make sure that they're eating healthy food. Make sure that they're getting lots of physical activity. Make sure that they're feeling love, that they understand mercy, that they spend time sitting together as a family where people are eating together. Maybe they're listening to. There's so many things that can balance out these other things that help put the thing back into balance. And really, it's coming back into their fitrah, which will help put the system into balance and can really sort of make up for whatever adverse effects the medication may be having. And then also, there's plenty of resources within our own prophetic tradition and Unani Tib and prophetic medicine where just about any pharmaceutical medication that they've come up with now has a natural remedy in our own tradition, and in my personal opinion, they're more effective. And so I think the more that we can connect back to these traditions and have those as resources, we won't need to rely on these other ones.
Please, can you write a book for children?
Yeah. Sure. I'll get on it.
Yeah, the question's about Abdallah, your path to Islam, and part of you referencing in an online video about being a Jedi aspirant, referencing Star Wars. So just please expand on that.
Yeah, and I think so to put it in context, because I think part of the question is like, look, popular culture and like the things that influence us and how to make things relevant too. I don't know if I should put one of our students on the spot and bring them up here, but with our BA students, I actually have a program that I put them through called Jedi training. And it sort of starts out with theory and literally using the Star Wars movies, but specifically the Jedi Order, and understanding, looking at it from this Star Wars universe, but that recognizing that has resonances from spiritual traditions across cultures and across times, and there's always been this tradition of sort of master and student, but then also of this understanding that we are, that there is a path of maximizing potential, and that the maximizing of our human potential is a holistic endeavor, that by strengthening your will and strengthening your physical training, your physical mastery, you're also integrally defining and mastering the self and the spiritual rigor of self-discipline. And it's really useful, I think, in something like Star Wars because it's fun and it's interesting, but also it makes it sort of exciting. Like, oh, this is about, you know, like this is the whole notion of being able to do things that we don't think are possible, and like breaking through our limitations, and that there is lots of stories within the Islamic tradition of scholars being able to do miraculous things, not because they themselves had power, but because they had actually gotten to a state of disciplining the nafs, of disciplining the self and the soul, that their nafs, their personal identification with the self, was so purified that they are able to maximize the actual potential that the human being has as Khalifatullah. And that's not to say that, you know, the Prophet ﷺ is our ultimate example, but not to just put the Prophet on a pedestal, but to say that we are actually capable of much more than we know and believe often. And so having this connection to the Islamic tradition in a way that's not just sitting down and studying books. And so I think it's really important for our students here at Cambridge Muslim College is I have a weekly session with them where I'm talking about, well, what is the, you know, you're learning all this stuff in fiqh and kalam and Quran and hadith studies, but what does it mean for you as an individual person, as a Muslim, as a human being, and inshallah as a budding scholar? We need, like I said, we need scholars that are emulating this illuminated heart, and that they're not just thinking, they're not just mastering thought, but mastering their physical body. Why? Because the soul is part of the body. The body is part of the soul. It's not separate. And we've gotten so far from that, where we're completely separate out these things where, oh, well, you know, the soul is sort of just a housing, the body is just a housing for the soul, and the soul is like understood in theory and religious discourse. But it needs to be brought together in this self-discipline and training, but also understood that the work on our soul, you know, there is different scholars in the Islamic tradition, like Mullah Sadra talks about that the soul, the body is a dense manifestation of the soul in the dunya. So it's very different than this notion that it's this useless sort of vessel for the soul, but that actually we have to honor and we access our potential and our submission to Allah through the whole picture, the whole being. And so this is sort of why I think those things are important, but it's useful to use these popular culture references because it's a beautiful and simple way of painting this thing that everyone seems to resonate with, you know, because there's some primordial fitra reality to it. We all know that there's something that we can be doing, that we have, and we as Muslims have a legacy of this. There only 100 years ago, if you're born Muslim, your great-grandparents, most likely from wherever they are from, had a sheikh in their community where there was a sort of master-disciple relationship, where there was a physical, embodied, living experience of learning Islam, not just theoretical book study.
So how do we bring Islamic psychotherapy more into a mainstream modality?
If I find the book.
I'm not saying to buy the book, but I'm saying that's why I wrote, so that's what I'm hoping that this book does, and that's why I went with a mainstream publisher in an academic research book, which is also probably why a lot of you have the headache of like, oh, it's so expensive, right? The reason why it's so expensive is because in academic publishing, it's marketed as a textbook. So it's a hardcover, and it's marketed primarily to universities and libraries, and it's part of a series of research that is within psychology. It's the first book in the entire Routledge research on psychology that has anything to do with Islam or presents an Islamic model. And so inshallah, what I hope that provides as a doorway is to not just for us as Muslims, but for the mainstream field of psychology to learn that Islam actually has a great deal to offer and that they can benefit from it. And now there's all kinds of talk about decolonized curriculum and decolonized psychology and indigenous psychology, and people are happy to learn from pretty much every other tradition but Islam, right? It's like everyone's looking for the wisdom traditions. But Islam has been left out because Islam gets a bad rap. And so I'm hoping that through psychology and through psychotherapy, it's represented in this way that is applicable and useful and accessible to our collective understanding of the human being as human beings, trying to understand, human beings have learned from many other wisdom traditions, and it's been integrated into the academy. And so I'm hoping that Islam is next. It has yet to have its day in the sun. And the reason why psychotherapy and not just psychology is because psychology tends to be like, well, you study psychology, you study people, then maybe it's like this understanding of the human being. And then psychotherapy is like application of really trying to help people. And from an Islamic perspective, those two things would never be separate. There would be no reason to understand the anatomy of the soul without understanding the application of it. And which is why in the first model in the book where I designed this anatomy, it's like the model of the soul, but even within the model itself, there are processes of change. Because it's not useful to just have knowledge for the sake of knowledge. It's for the purpose of development and change. And so I think it's really useful to understand it in the framework and terminology and sort of venue of this convention of like 50-minute sessions that you can pay somebody, or maybe inshallah one day get NHS to cover it, but that it's accessible. I can go to a clinic and I can fit it within my busy schedule and within my disaggregated way of life where I'm not part of a community, but I'm still accessing the Islamic wisdom and the tradition of healing in a way that is practical and that people can learn to train in. The whole idea of an Islamic psychotherapist, and again, there's a diagram from chapter 6 in the book where I talk about the scope of Islamic psychotherapy, and I make this distinction with what is possible within a clinical, where somebody can train versus like what we would understand a Sufi sheikh doing in terms of like this really in-depth development of reaching higher and higher levels of the soul. And it's not to create a binary, because I think there's oftentimes what the shaykh that I study with, they were master psychologists. They understood precisely what this person needs to understand from their specific situation, and oftentimes it had nothing to do with giving them a fiqh answer or stating aqidah or theology. It was like, just adi, like do what you need to shift this in your life, and so anyway, the the thing that this posits, though, is that the therapist in this model needs to have knowledge, Islamic knowledge. They need to be studying the Islamic sciences. They don't have to know it in the depth that a full scholar of a mutakallimin, or they don't have to be at that level, but they need a foundational knowledge to know how it stays within the parameters of the fold of Islam. And then they have to, more importantly, be doing the work on themselves, to be cleaning their own heart, to be facing the difficulties in their own psychology, putting themselves into a balance and really engaging in this jihad of nafs, because it is the therapeutic method is the heart of the therapist. And there's this openness and this transmission, so that through this, the therapist becomes a mirror. Just like the Prophet ﷺ, that the believer is a mirror for the believer. What does that mirror? The mirror is a doorway to be able to access Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the mirror, it can only work if it's not turbid. And the turbidity is like this crust, the rust on our heart. And so we have to polish. And so in this model, a therapist needs to constantly be engaged in their own therapy, in their own jihad an-nafs, in their own tazkiyat an-nafs, the purification of the soul, purification of the heart. Not necessarily to be at the level of a sheikh, but to be at the whatever level. There's, any level that you get to, there's going to be somebody that you can help on this pathway and become a khalil or a friend, or as Imam al-Ghazali says in Ihya al-Ulumuddin, rafiq. And so he positions, he says, the way to come to know the self and to struggle in the self, like that, and that's the goal, is what he's saying. That the ideal is to have a sheikh that is the mastered this thing, and like our predecessors had, somebody who's in the silsila of his hand was in the sheikh of his hand was in the hand that was in the hand that was in the hand of the Prophet. But he said even in his time, in the 12th century, that was very rare. It's rare to find somebody like this. And so he says, you can't do it alone. You can't go on this journey of inward reflection by yourself, because we will delude ourselves. We hear this thing, if you don't have a sheikh, shaitan is your sheikh. Well, we can become our own sort of pitfalls to ourselves, and so we need a mirror, we need a reflection. And so Imam Ghazali says there's a second pathway, and that second pathway is the sound companion, and that this person is familiar with the territory of navigating the soul, meaning that they've done their own work, they're constantly engaged in this tazkiyah, in this working on themselves, and that through that you can sort of be side by side as a companion on this path, rather than this sort of hierarchical or master-student relationship of a sheikh. But it's like, hey, I'm here with you, I'm doing my work also, and through that work I've learned some tools and techniques, I've studied the anatomy, and but I've also done a lot of muhasabah and self-awareness and working on myself constantly. And so from that, I can help you to deal with at least reaching a state of equilibrium. And then if the person wants to keep going, most of us are just trying to get to balance. We're not even at the level of like beyond nafs al-mutmainna and into like these high states of spiritual attainment. Like for those people, they can inshallah find the true guides. But for the majority, we just need the level of putting ourselves into balance and finding equilibrium. And there's plenty to do, and there's plenty of people who are willing to be that mirror, and we can now, inshallah, train them to do this work. And it can be at whatever level is appropriate or needed but it's all about the engagement towards self-knowledge for both the client and the therapist. And so that's a really important aspect, is that we recognize that it has a place. There's even in the 12th century, Ghazali sort of gave us this pathway for the solution. And I think now, especially in these times when we're all sort of removed from this fitra way of living and this Islamic communities and the guidance of these mashayikh, we are in dire need of implementing this as a contemporary solution to our times so that we can heal and also reconnect with the heart of the Islamic tradition, inshallah.
What a blessing to be a conduit for that good in this whole process.
I mean, if Allah allows me and all of us, inshallah, to be.
Thank you so much for listening and for being here, and thank you, Dr. Rothman, for sharing.
My pleasure.
For sharing today.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, everybody.